It's Friday the 15th of September and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, a former Conservative Prime Minister tells the government it needs to be tougher on security.
What we need to do is to recognise that China is the largest threat.
The Labour leader Keir Starmer demands answers after a terror suspect escaped from Wandsworth Prison.
Despite being charged with terrorism and despite being a flight risk, he was not held in a Category A prison.
It is not and has never been the policy that they are all held in Category A prisons.
The House of Lords defeats government plans to scrap water pollution rules to encourage house building.
This is one of the worst pieces of legislation I have ever seen.
This is the sort of short-term political manoeuvring that does nothing. It does nothing to benefit the British people.
Plans to pilot drug consumption rooms in Scotland, but will they work? And MPs approve plans to make the possession of laughing gas illegal by the end of the year. Well, the week began with a security scare and allegations of Chinese spying at the heart of Parliament. Susan, how did this come out?
Well, it emerged in press reports over the weekend which said that a parliamentary researcher and another man had been arrested, actually way back in March, under the Official Secrets Act in relation to China. Now, the former researcher has strongly denied that. But there has been a lot of concern even before any of this in Parliament about interference from China, and there's been a very serious report from a Security Committee of Parliament as well. So MPs had a lot of questions about whether the government had ignored warnings and indeed whether they had raised this matter in detail. For example, when the Foreign Secretary went to Beijing not very long ago, just this month, and whether really commercial and economic issues I've been putting some of those political ones on a back burner. They also want to know why they hadn't known about this sooner. So when it was raised in the chamber right away at the beginning of the week, there were a lot of questions about that. But they were told by the Speaker that they were very constrained in what they could say about that researcher in case they risked prejudicing a fair trial in the future.
We keep our security arrangements under review at all times in order to deal with the evolving threats. The extreme small number of people who needed to know were immediately briefed on a strictly confidential basis, given the national security of this sensitive matter.
It remains an absolute priority for the government to take all necessary steps to protect the United Kingdom from any foreign state activity which seeks to undermine our national security, prosperity and democratic values. The government has been clear that China represents a systemic challenge to the United Kingdom and to our values.
MI5 issued an interference alert about the Chinese Communist Party attempting to influence Parliament 20 months ago. The Security Service and others have also raised wider concerns. The Minister referred to the Prime Minister raising strong concerns about unacceptable interference with China. Can I ask, did the Prime Minister do so at the time of these arrests, or has he only done so now since they have been made public?
Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary regularly raise with their Chinese opposite numbers Chinese interference in democratic institutions. This is an ongoing approach that has been going on for some time.
When did the Deputy Prime Minister himself learn of these allegations and of these arrests. Why did MPs only learn of this from the Times? And will the government institute, as soon as possible, a review into the decision-making process that led to MPs not being told about this, in order that critical updates like this are given to MPs in future and this decision-making process is never allowed to happen again?
Order, I'm going to be very careful, but this is a major security issue, and it would be wrong to expect to break all that in order to brief MPs. The MPs that were needed to be told were told.
What we need to do is to recognise that China is the largest threat, both to the world and to the United Kingdom, for freedom and democracy. And does he not agree that the government should designate it as such?
It is also the case, for example, in respect of our economic security. It is the #1 state-based threat to our economic security. And what I would say to my right honourable friend is that the government is absolutely clear-eyed about the threats that this nation faces and robust in taking action. Indeed, that's why I personally took the decisions in respect of banning Huawei from our 5G networks, in respect of Chinese CCTV technology, and indeed in relation to TikTok.
And can I just say to my right honourable friend, very importantly, that the problem lies in the mess we've got into over what we define China as with respect to us. Are they a threat or are they not? If they are a threat, why do we not call them a threat and take the relative action that is necessary to deal with them on that basis and sanction some people?
Prime Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend, who is a former Cabinet Minister and current Privy Councillor, knows full well that the government does not provide running commentary on updates and intelligence received by ministers.
And the Prime Minister said he had raised the subject when he met his Chinese counterpart at the G20 meeting of industrial nations in Delhi. How did that go?
Well, straight after that statement specifically about China, the Prime Minister came to give an update about that G20 summit. But a lot of that was dominated by this question about Chinese interference in UK politics. And the Labour leader said he'd been listening to the answers and he still wanted to know, since presumably the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary had known back in March about this researcher, had they asked about that one specifically? Or was it only once the rest of us knew about it that it started to be something they said they put to the Chinese?
Mr. Speaker, I also met Premier Li of China. The whole House is rightly appalled about reports of espionage in this building. The sanctity of this place must be protected, and the right of members to speak their minds without fear or sanction must be maintained. We will defend our democracy and our security. So I was emphatic with Premier Li that actions which seek to undermine British democracy are completely unacceptable and will never be tolerated.
Given the arrest happened in March, can I ask the Prime Minister if the Foreign Secretary knew about this incident before he visited China last month? And if he did he raise it on that trip?
I'm sure he'll appreciate that as there is an ongoing investigation, as you've also said, Mr. Speaker, as I'm limited in what I can say specifically, but I've been emphatically clear in our engagement with China that we will not accept any interference in our democracy and parliamentary system. This includes sanctioning of MPs and malign activity, such as the type of activity alleged to have taken place. I can absolutely confirm that the Foreign Secretary raised these issues on his recent visit, and I also reinforce this in my meeting at the G20.
All right, that was the Prime Minister there. Thank you very much, Susan. We'll come back to you and Westminster shortly, but let's go to Edinburgh now and to our Scotland political correspondent, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, the big story of the week there has been arrangements to pilot drug consumption rooms. How will that scheme work?
That's right. As you say, it has been the big story everyone's been talking about this week. Now, drugs consumption rooms are in operation in a number of other countries. The idea is that people who take drugs can take them in a supervised facility where medical help is on hand, with the aim of preventing deaths from overdoses. The Scottish Government has been really keen to set up some drugs consumption rooms in Scotland, but of course drugs policy is reserved to Westminster, and there's been the risk that people involved would be prosecuted under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Now, there was a significant intervention this week by the Lord Advocate, who's Scotland's most senior law officer and head of the prosecution service. She made a statement saying that she didn't think it would be in the public interest to prosecute people for possession of drugs within a pilot drugs consumption facility. So that was seen as really paving the way for such a pilot to go ahead. But of course, the question was, what would the UK government do? What would their reaction be? Would they try and stop it? And the Scottish Government has continued to ask for the UK Government to get behind such a pilot.
This is a significant step forward for us in Scotland. However, even with this helpful position from the Lord Advocate, a safer drug consumption facility operating in Scotland will still be restricted by the Misuse of Drugs Act. Therefore, the best approach would be for the UK Government to give us approval for a safer drug consumption facility, so I would again repeat my call to the UK Government to work with us on this issue and either give us that approval for a pilot or devolve the necessary powers to us.
I have reservations about the effectiveness of consumption rooms. However, the decision made by the Lord Advocate yesterday tells us that there was always a way to do this, and the SNP now have one less excuse for their failures. It is now up to the SNP government to demonstrate that safe consumption rooms can work, to back our crucial Right to Recovery bill, and to finally start tackling the drug deaths crisis that Nicola Sturgeon and now Humza Yousaf have presided over.
I welcome the intervention by the Lord Advocate. Not prosecuting people for using safe consumption rooms is a pragmatic approach and allows progress to be made in the pilot scheme in Glasgow. But as others, including anti-poverty campaigner Darren McGarvey, have commented, the law has not changed. The constitutional fighting between two governments has thankfully not stood in the way of progress. The shame is that this could have been done ages ago and perhaps more lives would have been saved.
And the second major intervention of the week was that on Wednesday, Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack said that while he didn't agree with drugs consumption rooms, the UK Government would not intervene to try and stop a pilot project in Scotland. So it looks likely that such a pilot will go ahead shortly in Glasgow.
OK, interesting. And meanwhile, a new licensing scheme is coming in for short-term letting in Scotland, but the Conservatives made calls this week for it to be delayed. Why was that?
Well, yes, actually quite a last-minute call for it to be delayed. The licensing scheme is already open for applications, and in fact, existing operators of things like Airbnbs or traditional B&Bs have only a couple more weeks to apply for a licence. The deadline is the 1st of October, otherwise they risk committing an offence if they continue operating. Now, the idea behind the scheme is to have kind of universal safety standards, make sure everyone has things like fire alarms, but also to deal with some of the problems in specific areas like Edinburgh, like parts of rural Scotland, where the number of short-term lets is causing problems for housing, for people to live in, for permanent residents, and also things like antisocial behaviour in holiday lets. But the argument from some of the opposition, from some business groups, is that it's been too wide-ranging, that the costs are prohibitive, and it may cause existing operators just simply to leave the market. And the Scottish Conservatives this week called for a delay for that deadline for licensing applications.
There was never any need for a one-size-fits-all approach to legislation. It would have been perfectly possible for the Scottish Government to have devolved to local councils the right to draw up rules for their own areas. Those with a history of complaints about the operation of self-catering lets would then have had the opportunity to take a different approach from those in other, perhaps more rural areas, where self-catering lets have been operating as part of the tourist sector for decades more, without any problems appearing. I think it's a source of regret that the Scottish Government decided to introduce a national scheme instead of letting councils have the discretion whether to introduce it locally.
We are a government that believes in fair regulation, and we do not believe that asking short-term let operators to comply with mandatory conditions and completing licence application is too much to ask. Quality and safety are at the heart of our scheme, whether their accommodation is being offered as a traditional bed and breakfast, other home sharing arrangement or stand-alone self-catering accommodation. This was an aspect that was as well tested through the 3 public consultations and the development of legislation in this Parliament. The safety component is mandated for all types of visitor accommodation in Scotland.
Now, that bid to put back the deadline failed. It was voted down by a majority of MSPs from the SNP and the Greens. So that 1st of October deadline still stands for applications for a licence for short-term let operators.
OK. And there have been questions about police funding, with Conservative leader Douglas Ross challenging the First Minister at First Minister's Questions. What did he say?
Well, yes, he brought up the question of things like police officer numbers and body-worn cameras, and that follows a session of the Criminal Justice Committee at Holyrood, where finance officers from the police and the fire service were giving evidence about budgets. And there were some particularly stark warnings. Police Scotland saying that if budgets remained flat, it was likely they'd have to cut something like 600 officers, 200 other staff, and it could go up to as much as 2,000 over the next few years, with the cumulative effect of flat budgets. Also questions about body-worn cameras, because Police Scotland is the last force in the UK to not have body-worn cameras as standard. They're due to roll out next year. Police Scotland's Deputy Chief Officer was asked could he guarantee that rollout would go ahead. He said no, he couldn't if something unforeseen came up that took a lot of resource, but he would do his utmost. And that was what Douglas Ross brought up at First Minister's Questions.
Police officer numbers in Scotland under the SNP are now at the lowest level in 14 years. That is a fact, First Minister, and that's what we are facing on the streets of Scotland right now. Police Scotland will be the last force in the UK to roll out body-worn cameras. Officers no longer have the resources to investigate every crime. Their workplaces are not fit for purpose, and now the number of officers could be cut by 2,000. The thin blue line is barely visible at this rate. So does the First Minister accept this, that with falling officer numbers, communities in Scotland will feel less safe?
When it comes to real terms increases in Police Scotland's budget, that's a fair enough call for any political party to make. And of course, we'll give that consideration when it comes to the budget. But has Douglas Ross ever asked himself why a real terms increase was difficult this year? Of course it was difficult, because inflation is sky high. Inflation is sky high because of his party's complete economic mismanagement of the public finances. So when it comes to real terms increases, of course we will give that consideration. But it was Douglas Ross a year ago that stood here that demanded the Scottish Government copy Liz Truss's disastrous mini budget. If we had done that, we wouldn't have money to spend on our police service or indeed any of our public services.
Now, of course, there is always that comeback, that question about the impact of inflation on budgets, which really is having a big impact. But concerns are increasing, particularly around things like policing and the kind of difficult decisions that are now having to be made about what can and cannot be done.
All right, Jenny Davidson in Edinburgh, thank you very much for the update there. Now let's go back to Westminster to talk about Prime Minister's Questions here in Westminster with Susan. And Keir Starmer raised in Prime Minister's Questions this week that issue of the escape from Wandsworth Prison that was really dominating the headlines last weekend.
Yeah, so the initial drama of the escape may have gone away after the recapture of the man, but it seems that the politics really still has a long way still to run. Keir Starmer asked not just about conditions in Wandsworth Prison, but he sort of widened it out to ask about security in general. And really that was the sort of political soft spot he went for. Can you trust the Prime Minister to keep the country safe? The sort of fundamental thing that governments have to do. And with an election not too far away, trust is obviously a huge issue for the voters. Not surprisingly then, the Prime Minister tried to turn the argument round. Can you trust Keir Starmer to do what he said he would do? And in fact, even the SNP leader was getting in the act. He was asking whether you can trust either of these men to keep their promises over the way pensions rise, what's known as the triple lock.
I pay tribute to the police who tracked down the escaped terror suspect from Wandsworth Prison last week. Yeah. Despite being charged with terrorism and despite being a flight risk, he was not held in a Category A prison. Why not?
Minister.
Well,
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the police and their partners for their efforts to find and arrest Daniel Khalif. There is now an ongoing legal process that must be allowed to take its course. But I'd like to reassure the public that while these cases are extremely rare, the Justice Secretary has launched an internal investigation about how this could happen, as well as an independent investigation of the incident, so that we can learn the lessons from this case and make sure that it never happens again.
The Chief Inspector of Prisons said conditions in Wandsworth are so bad it should be shut down. The Chancellor is telling anyone who'll listen that he raised concerns months ago. Probation, school buildings, now prisons. Why does the Prime Minister keep ignoring the warnings until it's too late?
Prime Minister! Because of the wide variety and considerable difference in severity of people charged under that Act, it is not and has never been the policy that they are all held in Category A prisons, something that I shouldn't need me to point out to him given his experience. But he talked about resourcing. I am happy to tell him that over the last few years, we have delivered an extra 4,000 new prison officers. Staffing levels at Wandsworth in particular are up by 25% in the past 6 years. And because we're boosting prison pay, we're also improving retention and at the same time investing £100 million to improve prison security with new measures like X-ray body scanners.
Probation, prison, schools, China. Yet again, Inaction Man fails to heed the warnings and then blames everyone else for the consequences. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, the Home Secretary celebrated her first anniversary in post. That is, if you overlook the 6 days she missed when she was deemed a national security risk. In that year, 40,000 people have crossed the Channel on a small boat. And the taxpayer is now spending £6 million a day on hotel bills. He's failing to stop terrorists strolling out of prison, failing to guard Britain against hostile actors. He's completely failing to stop the boats. How can anyone trust him to protect the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about trust. He talks about action. Just today, this government is taking action to reform defective EU laws to unlock over 100,000 homes, boosting our economy, supporting jobs and ensuring that we can realise the aspirations of homeowners. Now, he talks about trust. He tried in this House to talk the talk on house building. But at the first sign of a cheap political hit, what did he do? He's caved in, Mr. Speaker. Rather than make the right long-term decisions for the country, he's taken the easy way out. It is typical of the principles-free, conviction-free type of leadership that he offers. Flip-flopping from being a builder to a blocker. Mr. Speaker, the British public can't trust a word he says.
Mr. Speaker, every week he comes here protesting that nothing's his fault, trying to convince anyone who's still listening that everything is great. The truth is, the floor fell in for millions of families because of their economic mayhem. The classroom ceilings collapsed because he cut vital school budgets. And now the walls of our national security have been breached because they've ignored repeated warnings. No one voted for these shambles. No one voted for him. So how much more damage do the British public have to put up with before he finally finds the stomach to give them a say?
Mr. Speaker, we are getting on for the British public just in the last week, announcing a new landmark deal for British scientists, attracting £600 million of new investment for our world-leading auto industry, and wages now rising at the fastest rate on record, Mr. Speaker. And where has he been this week? Locked away with Labour's union paymasters, promising to give them more power and scrap the laws that protect British families and their access to public services. It's clear it's only the Conservatives that are on the side of the hard-working British public.
May I ask the Prime Minister, who does he think will scrap the state pension triple lock first? His government or the Labour Party's government?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, thanks to the actions of this government, pensioners in Scotland are receiving record increases in their state pension, £870 this year, extra support with the cost of living this winter. This is the government that introduced and remains committed to the triple lock. But he does raise a good point, Mr. Speaker. Pensioners in Scotland should know the reason they can rely on the state pension, not just today but for years to come, because of the strength of our union and the strength of our United Kingdom government.
Well, we heard Rishi Sunak there saying that Labour should be a builder, not a blocker, and that was referencing the government's plan to scrap water pollution rules to encourage house building in England. But then it was just a few hours later that day that the Lords voted down that plan, didn't they? Is that the end of it, or can the government bring it back now?
Well, the simple answer is no, they can't. I won't get too deep into the weeds of why not, the technicalities, but basically because they brought this whole new idea to put into the Levelling Up bill so late in the day, in the sort of process of that bill in the House of Lords, once the House of Lords voted it down, there isn't any way of bringing it back. It's now defunct for now anyway. The government must have known that. Maybe they were doing it to try and flush out Labour and to be able to, as you heard the Prime Minister just then, portray them as blocking house building, because of course the government and its supporters say England does need these thousands and thousands of new homes and houses built. But the critics say waters around the UK are already extremely polluted, and you can't do anything that's going to make that even worse.
It simply cannot be acceptable to amend one of our key environmental protections like this. These amendments also fly in the face of the Environment Statement on the front of this bill, which states, I quote, "The bill will not have the effect of reducing the level of environmental protection provided for by any existing environmental law." That doesn't seem to be the case.
I was surprised that these late amendments weren't sent back to the lawyers for corrective, but for defective drafting, because as has been said, it is now requiring public bodies to look both ways at one time, facing different requirements in different bits of legislation. And as Matthew Paris said in his recent Times article, basically, under the government proposals, when considering an application to build, the authorities must assume that what poisons rivers does not poison rivers. My lords, this is madness. Planning authorities currently have a responsibility to take all material considerations into account, including the need for more housing and the need for more environmental protections. So these government proposals would undermine our evidence-based planning system and set a dangerous precedent.
This is utterly disruptive and completely unplanned, and in my view is the evidence and the argument for treating this particular circumstance as a special case in which the government, I think, needs to take steps to sort this out, untangle ourselves, and make a plan which allows us to deliver all of our objectives, our house-building objectives and our environmental objectives.
Now, I rather object to the fact that the newspapers say that I am a Conservative rebel. I have to say it is the government that is the rebel here, because the government is not Conservative over this. First of all, it is asking local authorities, and I can hardly believe it, to disregard the facts. Yeah. This is a kind of attitude that you see in the Republican Party of the United States. The people who don't believe in climate change, the people who are anti-vaxxers, don't look at the facts. I have to say to this House, this is one of the worst pieces of legislation I have ever seen. And I've been around a long time.
Now, I know I'm a bit cynical about this rotten government, but even I would not have predicted that the government would choose such a blatant act of environmental vandalism as these late amendments to the Levelling Up bill. Our rivers and streams are already being pumped full of excrement on a daily basis, so why would ministers feel it's all right to pump any more in?
I'm afraid the party opposite is planning to vote down laws that would unlock 100,000 new homes and enhance the environment, my lords. My Lords, they've ignored the pleas of their own council leaders and the entire development industry, including social housing builders, to back government plans. My Lords, this is the sort of short-term political manoeuvring that does nothing. It does nothing to benefit the British people.
Well, I think we'll leave that rather passionate debate in the Lords there. Thank you very much, Susan. Let's go to Cardiff now and to our Wales political correspondent, Rhodri Lewis, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, where new traffic speed limits have been occupying members. When do they come in, Rhodri?
Well, Charlotte, it all starts this Sunday, actually, when pretty much every road in Wales that currently has a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit will see that reduced to 20, unless the local council has applied for an exemption. Now, the debate over this has intensified over the summer as this deadline has moved ever closer, so it was inevitable that it would be debated here in the Senedd in the first week of the new term. And the Conservative Shadow Transport Minister was quite emphatic.
FYI, when the Senedd debated this backward policy earlier in the year, the Welsh Conservatives, including myself, my leader Andrew Arty-Davies and Janet Finn-Saunders as well, voted unequivocally against it as well alongside me and these benches. As politicians, it's our job to represent our constituencies and be the voice of our residents. Residents have had their say on this proposal and the verdict is resounding. They do not want this costly, ill-thought-out, disastrous blanket 20-mile-per-hour speed limit project. They want to see a targeted approach with a speed limit reduced outside schools, playgrounds, busy places instead.
Speed will come down. Fewer people will be killed. Fewer people will have life-changing injuries. The burden on the police and the fire service of attending deadly collisions will ease. More people will feel safe in their communities and feel confident to walk and cycle around them. The second biggest public health harm, noise pollution, will lessen, and parents will start to feel more confident letting their children play outside.
Now, the change coming in this Sunday will make Wales the first UK nation to bring in 20-mile-an-hours, but ministers say they will keep an eye on how the changes are going down.
OK, thanks, Rhodri. And elsewhere, the financial problems of Welsh hospitals are still a major concern, aren't they?
Yes, analysis by BBC Wales suggests the overspend in Welsh hospitals may be as much as £800 million by the end of this financial year. And as with other parts of the UK, hospitals have been hit by inflation, which has obviously increased staff and the cost of drugs, and the cost of staff and the cost of drugs, and demand for treatment has gone up because of the post-COVID backlog. Now, here this week, the Health Minister said she'd asked Wales's health boards to try to find some extra money. She said she wanted them to concentrate on 6 priorities she'd already outlined, including having better cancer treatment and better cooperation between different parts of the NHS and so on. But the Tories here said that wasn't good enough.
Health services are affected right across the UK and around the world. I accept that, but it is this Labour government is the only government in the UK to have cut the health budget, not once, but twice. That's a decision that you've made here in Wales. Now, you're asking health boards, Minister, to do more for less. You write to health boards, you set out your priorities, correctly so, but if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And what I would ask, Minister, have you also told health boards what should not be their priority? Because I don't think that you can have both ways on this.
I have been very clear with the health boards that actually you have to focus on 6 priorities. That's the first time they've had such clarity on, I recognise you can't do everything under the current budget situation, so here's your 6 priorities for you to focus on. So I have been very clear on that. Now, the next question is, what are you going to deprioritise? Because that's true as well. So I've already asked them to make sure that they are not making interventions where we know that the health consequence is not where it should be.
Now, the Minister also said that, unlike in previous years, the Welsh Government wouldn't be able to step in and plug this gap because the money simply wasn't there to do that. OK, and what came up at First Minister's questions this week, Rhodri? Well, Charlotte, one of the likely themes we're going to hear a lot about as we get closer to the next Westminster general election is that the Conservatives will point at Labour's record on government here in Wales as evidence of how a possible Labour administration at Westminster under Sir Keir Starmer would run the rest of the UK. However, Plaid Cymru here are taking a somewhat different tack, and their leader asked whether a Labour government, a future Labour government at Westminster, really would work for Wales.
We know that governments need resources in order to tackle inequalities and injustice. You know, at the heart of my vision, a positive vision for Wales, government need resources in order to invest in infrastructure. And so far, the UK Labour Party has shown little interest in doing that. Keir Starmer seems pretty committed to doing whatever it takes to get into Downing Street. But what about the commitment to Wales? There's no commitment to giving Wales its £6 billion fair share of HS2 and Northern Powerhouse rail funding. No commitment to undoing the real terms cut in public sector pay, and that's despite the Labour First Minister for Wales saying he wants both.
Well, the leader of Plaid Cymru knows perfectly well that those are not pledges for me to make. What he is busy doing, so let's be clear about the political narrative that he is attempting to build here. He's attempting to persuade people that a Labour government that has not even yet been elected and will only ever be elected because of the efforts of people on this side of the chamber, and certainly not efforts that he will ever contribute to, that Labour government that we haven't even elected is already let them down.
Now, as you might expect, Mark Drakeford also said he was confident there'd be a different relationship between Westminster and Wales from the one that exists at the moment if a Labour government was elected in London.
All right, Rodri Lewis in Cardiff, thank you very much for the update. Back in Westminster then, and there were a couple of things that came before Parliament this week relating to the safety of young people. So there was the online safety bill and also the issue of nitrous oxide laughing gas. Let's start with the online safety bill. What's that meant to achieve?
Well, I suppose we've had the internet for around 30 years now, and here's the governments generally around the world trying to play catch up, trying to stop some of the bad stuff that happens online alongside all the good stuff that makes our lives better or easier. The online safety bill tries to do that. It's been years in the making, actually, with lots of amendments and tweaking along the way. And one of its chief aims is to protect children, really, from online harm, such as contact from sexual abusers or being drawn into social media, encouraging self-harm, that kind of thing. It is now, finally, on the brink of becoming law, and that's been generally welcomed by MPs. They do have a bit of a worry still that a law that's going to be printed on vellum, tied up with pink ribbon, is able to be flexible enough to keep pace with the fast-moving world of tech.
This bill is world-leading. The legislative framework established by the Online Safety Bill will lead to the creation of a profoundly safer online environment in this country. It'll kickstart change where it's sorely needed. It'll ensure our children are better protected against pornography and other content harmful to children. The bill will also guard children against perpetrators of abhorrent child sexual exploitation and abuse, and ensure tech companies take responsibility for tackling this content on their platforms or be held criminally accountable. Currently, the information that social media companies give to UK law enforcement contributes to over 800 arrests or voluntary attendances of suspected child sexual offenders on average every month, and results in an estimated 1,200 children being safeguarded from child sexual abuse. Now, there's no intention by the government to weaken the encryption technology used by platforms. As a last resort, on a case-by-case basis, and only when stringent privacy safeguards have been met, Ofcom will have the power to direct companies to either use or make best efforts to develop or source technology to identify and remove illegal child sexual abuse content. We know this technology can be developed.
Let us be clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill has sadly fallen victim to Tory infighting from day one. The party on the opposite benches truly cannot decide if they are the party of protecting children or the party of free speech, when they should be the party of both. Put simply, we could have been left in a position where some of the most harmful websites and platforms, including 4chan and BitChute, which regularly host and promote far-right anti-Semitic content, could have slipped through the cracks of this legislation.
I must admit, still being a little bit confused over the government's stance on end-to-end encryption. It sounds like the Minister has acknowledged that there's no sufficiently accurate and privacy-preserving technology currently in existence, and that the last resort power would only come into effect once the technology was there. So technically this means the government haven't moved on the requirement of Ofcom to use last resort powers, but many security experts believe it could be many years before any such technology is developed, if ever. And this worries me. Of course, I'm really supportive of protecting user privacy, but it's also fundamentally right that terrorism or child sexual exploitation rings should not be able to proliferate unhindered on these channels. The right to privacy must be trumped by the need to stop events which could lead to mass death and harm of innocent animals and adults and children.
This is not just about wickedness that would have taken place anyway, now taking place on the internet. It's about the internet catalysing and exaggerating that wickedness. So what it's actually done is to spawn all kinds of malevolence and encourage that. And we have a big responsibility in this place to regulate and control, indeed to stop that. And she's absolutely right to emphasise it.
The huge importance of the parent being able to, where necessary, to rapidly intervene, because this has to be done damn quickly. Because if you go down a black hole or look like going down one, you want to stop that right away, absolutely. Because the thought of a kid seeing something really horrid, which could damage for life. So every one of us in our childhood, when we were little, 4, 5, 6, we saw something that frightened us. Something that gave us a real fright. And oddly enough, you never forget that for the rest of life, do you? That's what bad dreams are made of.
I want to urge all those who follow the progress of this bill and look at this issue not to make the mistake of thinking that when we're talking about dangerous online suicide and self-harm related content, that it's somehow about freedom of speech. That's not about freedom of speech. It's about protecting people. Let's be clear. When we're talking about online material that's dangerous relating to suicide and self-harm, it's not a freedom of speech issue. It's an issue of protecting people.
We fought and argued for social media users to have A, the option of being verified online, B, being only able to follow and be followed by verified accounts if that is what you want to do, and crucially to make it clear who is and is not verified online. So you can still be Princess Unicorn if you want, but at the back end your address and details can be held.
That's online safety. We also learnt this week that there's going to be a ban on nitrous oxide or laughing gas, but it will still be able to be used in some circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. This is the government carrying out its decision to ban nitrous oxide, which is quite a commonly used recreational drug, and non-users may be increasingly aware of seeing the discarded little silver canisters lying around in places like parks. It will still be okay to use it in medicine, where it's used as a mild painkiller, and also in catering, where they use it to make whipped cream, apparently. Some in the medical profession don't think it's a good idea to ban it, that it will just cause inconvenience and not reduce harm very much, but Labour didn't oppose the ban, so it went ahead.
The evidence we've seen around the neurological damage caused by particularly large-scale consumption of nitrous oxide is very worrying. Neurological units around the country have seen cases of people who have been paralysed and suffered really quite serious consequences. Now, the numbers aren't enormous, but they are extremely worrying, and the severe cases, including, as I say, paralysis, are deeply concerning, fuelling antisocial behaviour, having an impact on the decent, hard-working majority who want to use their local park or go down their local high street without being harassed by antisocial behaviour or seeing the little silver canisters littered all over the place. And by the way, just to give an illustration of the scale of this, after the Notting Hill Carnival a couple of weeks ago, it is estimated that 13 tonnes of these silver canisters, nitrous oxide canisters, and others were collected by the clean-up crews from the street. That is an extraordinary amount.
The government will achieve very little through these measures this evening, except perhaps to cause considerable disruption to industry and legitimate medicinal uses of nitrous oxide. And I'm far from convinced from the changing reassurances that the Minister gave in that respect.
MPs talking about banning laughing gas, nitrous oxide there. Thank you very much, Susan. I think that's all we've got time for this week. Politics UK will be back next week, and Cho Coburn will be here with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.